She lived surrounded by luxury, but every expensive wall around her felt like part of a prison. The Whitmore estate stood on one of the highest hills overlooking the city, surrounded by iron gates, private security, and enough wealth to make ordinary people stop and stare whenever they passed near it. Massive marble fountains decorated the front entrance, while black luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway with quiet precision. Crystal chandeliers glowed behind towering windows every evening like the mansion itself wanted the world to admire it. From the outside, the estate looked perfect. Inside, Elena Whitmore felt like she was suffocating. That was the emotional hook. Because sometimes the richest women live inside the most invisible prisons. Elena moved silently through the long hallway outside her bedroom, while servants avoided direct eye contact around her. Everything inside the mansion operated according to routine. Breakfast at 7, public appearances carefully scheduled, charity events, political dinners, controlled conversations, controlled smiles, controlled lives. Nothing inside the Whitmore family happened naturally anymore, especially not Elena's future. At 24 years old, Elena had spent most of her life understanding one painful truth about powerful families. Children were rarely raised to become individuals. They were raised to become assets. That was the intellectual hook, because wealthy families often protect their reputation more fiercely than they protect the people inside it. Her father, Senator Richard Whitmore, built his career through influence, strategic alliances, and public respectability. To the outside world, he represented discipline and leadership. Cameras loved him. Voters trusted him. News reporters described him as one of the cleanest political figures in the state. But Elena understood something most people never saw. Powerful men often look kindest in public. At home, they became something colder, not physically cruel, emotionally unreachable. Richard Whitmore valued obedience more than happiness. Reputation mattered more than emotion. Every decision inside the family served one purpose: maintaining power. And now Elena had become part of one of those decisions. Her marriage. The thought alone tightened her chest every time it surfaced. Elena entered her bedroom quietly and closed the door behind her before finally allowing composure to disappear from her face. Her room looked more like a luxury suite inside a royal hotel than a normal bedroom. Expensive white furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows, imported artwork, soft gold lighting. Beautiful. Empty. That was the emotional hook. Because luxury loses its meaning the moment people are no longer free to leave it. She walked toward the large window overlooking the city skyline and folded her arms tightly. Somewhere beyond the massive estate walls, ordinary people lived ordinary lives. They chose who they loved. They walked freely through crowded streets. They made mistakes without newspapers discussing them publicly. Elena envied them more than she envied wealth. Her engagement ring rested heavily against her finger as she stared at the city below, a symbol of commitment or ownership. Sometimes she no longer knew the difference. Adrian Vale. Even thinking his name created tension inside her body. The man terrified her in ways she struggled to explain aloud, because Adrian rarely behaved violently in public. He remained calm almost all the time. Controlled, sophisticated, intelligent. That was what made him dangerous. Men who lost control emotionally could be predicted. Adrian never lost control. That was the intellectual hook. Because the most frightening people are often the ones who remain calm while everyone else panics. Elena first met Adrian nearly a year earlier during one of her father's private political fundraisers. She still remembered the silence that spread subtly through the room the moment Adrian entered. Not dramatic silence. Careful silence. The kind created when people instinctively feared someone powerful. Politicians suddenly adjusted their posture around him. Businessmen smiled too carefully. Even security guards unconsciously stepped aside whenever Adrian moved through a room. Power followed him naturally, and everyone felt it. Elena noticed something else too that night. Nobody ever told Adrian no. That realization unsettled her immediately, because men unaccustomed to refusal eventually stopped recognizing limits entirely. That was the emotional hook, because power becomes dangerous once people stop challenging it. Adrian Vale did not officially belong to organized crime according to public records. Technically, he operated as an international businessman connected to shipping companies, financial investments, luxury real estate, and private security firms. But rumors traveled quietly through elite circles. Missing people, destroyed competitors, judges suddenly changing decisions, entire businesses collapsing after conflicts with Adrian's organization. Nothing was ever traced directly to him. That was the terrifying part. His violence existed invisibly. That was the intellectual hook. Because truly powerful men rarely dirty their own hands publicly. Elena still remembered the first conversation they shared during that fundraiser. Adrian spoke calmly, almost politely, but his attention felt overwhelming, like being studied instead of spoken to. He noticed details too quickly. The hesitation in people's voices, the discomfort hidden behind smiles, the fear beneath confidence, and worst of all, he noticed Elena watching him. From that moment forward, his attention never fully left her. At first, Elena believed her father simply wanted a business alliance between two powerful families. That was normal inside political society. Strategic marriages happened constantly behind polished smiles and expensive ceremonies. But months later, Elena understood the truth. This was never merely an arrangement. Adrian wanted her specifically. That frightened her more than anything else. Because obsession from powerful men rarely ended safely. That was the emotional hook. Because affection becomes terrifying once it starts feeling unavoidable. A soft knock interrupted Elena's thoughts. "Come in," she said quietly. Her mother entered carefully, carrying several fashion catalogs against her chest. Victoria Whitmore looked elegant as always, dressed perfectly even inside her own home. Years of political life trained her to appear composed under any circumstances. Unfortunately, she passed that expectation on to her daughter too. Victoria placed the catalogs onto the bed slowly. "The wedding designers need your final selection tonight." Elena looked away toward the window again. "I already told Dad I don't want this marriage." Her mother's expression tightened immediately. Not sympathetic. Exhausted. That was the intellectual hook. Because some women inside powerful families stop resisting long before their daughters do. "Your father already made the agreement," Victoria answered carefully. "The situation is bigger than emotions now." Elena almost laughed hearing that. Bigger than emotions. That phrase defined her entire life. Every painful sacrifice inside elite society eventually became bigger than emotions. That was the emotional hook. Because controlling families often treat feelings like obstacles instead of human needs. "Elena," her mother continued softly, "Adrian Vale is not someone your father can simply disappoint." There it was. Fear. Real fear. Even her mother feared Adrian. Elena turned slowly. "Then why are we pretending this is a marriage instead of transaction?" Victoria said nothing immediately, because there was no honest answer. That silence told Elena everything she already knew. That was the intellectual hook, because silence often reveals truth more clearly than words ever could. After her mother left, Elena sat alone near the edge of the bed staring at the untouched wedding catalog spread across expensive white sheets. Dozens of dresses. Dozens of carefully designed versions of the same prison. She closed the catalogs immediately, because imagining herself inside one of those dresses made panic rise violently inside her chest. Not because she feared marriage itself, because she feared Adrian, the way he looked at her, the way conversations shifted whenever he entered rooms, the way her father suddenly became nervous discussing him privately, and most importantly, the way Adrian spoke about their future, like her choice no longer mattered. That was the emotional hook. Because losing freedom happens gradually, until one day people realize their decisions no longer belong to them. Days passed quickly after that. The wedding date moved closer, while the estate transformed into preparation chaos. Florists arrived every morning. Security increased around the property. Politicians, celebrities, and wealthy business elites confirmed attendance publicly. The city treated the upcoming marriage like a historic event. Nobody asked Elena what she wanted. That was the intellectual hook. Because society often celebrates women's suffering as long as it looks glamorous enough. At dinner one evening, Elena finally gathered enough courage to confront her father directly. The massive dining room remained silent, except for silverware touching expensive plates, while staff moved quietly nearby. "I won't marry him." The sentence immediately froze the room. Richard Whitmore slowly lowered his wine glass before looking directly at his daughter. "You don't understand the importance of this alliance." Elena's hands tightened beneath the table. "No, you don't understand how afraid I am." For one brief moment, real emotion crossed her father's expression, then disappeared again beneath political composure. "Fear fades," he answered coldly. "Security lasts." Elena stared at him in disbelief. Security. That was all this marriage represented to him. Political protection, financial influence, connections. Her happiness never entered the equation at all. That was the emotional hook. Because some parents sacrifice their children's freedom while convincing themselves it's love. "You're giving me away to a man everyone fears." Richard's jaw tightened slightly. People fear powerful men all the time. And what happens when powerful men become cruel? The question lingered heavily across the table. But Richard Whitmore never answered it, because deep down, he already knew that was the intellectual hook. Because people who benefit from power often ignore its cruelty until it threatens someone they love. Later that night, Elena stood alone outside on the massive balcony connected to her bedroom while cold wind moved through the darkness around her. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine escape seriously. Not fantasies. Real escape. A different city. A different name. Freedom. The thought felt impossible, but also intoxicating. Because no amount of luxury could compete with the idea of finally controlling her own life. That was the emotional hook. Because freedom becomes addictive the moment trapped people start imagining it. Then headlights appeared below the estate gates. Black vehicles. Several of them, moving with calm precision through the long driveway. Elena's breathing immediately slowed. She recognized those cars. Adrian. Fear settled sharply into her chest as security guards instantly adjusted around the arriving convoy. Even from the balcony above, Elena noticed how quickly people became nervous whenever Adrian arrived unexpectedly. The front doors opened below, and Adrian Vale stepped inside the mansion, wearing an expensive black coat beneath the glow of crystal lights. Tall, controlled, emotionally unreadable, dangerous in the quietest possible way. Elena stepped backward instinctively from the balcony railing, because something about tonight felt different. He hadn't been expected, and unexpected visits from men like Adrian usually meant one thing: control. That was the intellectual hook, because possessive people appear most dangerous when they feel something slipping away from them. Minutes later, another knock sounded against Elena's bedroom door. Before she could answer, the door opened slowly. Two women entered carrying a large white garment bag, carefully between them. Wedding fabric. Elena's heartbeat stopped briefly. Then Adrian appeared behind them. Calm, silent, watching her. The women carefully placed a garment bag across the bed before leaving immediately, closing the door behind them. Now only Elena and Adrian remained inside the room. Alone, the silence between them felt unbearable. Adrian's gray eyes moved toward the dress resting across the bed, then back toward Elena. "You will wear this tomorrow night," he said calmly. Not a suggestion, a decision. And in that moment, Elena realized the wedding was no longer something she could refuse. Because Adrian Vale had already decided she belonged to him. And the terrifying part was that nobody around them seemed willing to stop him. He did not fall in love with her. He decided she belonged to him. The moment Adrian Vale placed the wedding dress inside Elena Whitmore's bedroom, the atmosphere inside the mansion changed completely. Not loudly, silently, the same way storms change the air before anyone saw lightning. Elena stood motionless near the balcony doors, while Adrian remained across the room beside the white garment bag resting on her bed. The expensive fabric reflected soft golden light beneath the chandelier, looking elegant enough to belong inside a royal ceremony. But Elena did not see beauty when she looked at it. She saw surrender. That was the emotional hook. Because some wedding dresses are not symbols of love. They are symbols of power. Adrian studied her quietly, without impatience. He always looked calm. That calmness unsettled people more than shouting ever could, because men who control their emotions completely usually controlled everything else too, especially fear. Elena noticed something terrifying about Adrian from the beginning. He never reacted emotionally when people resisted him. He simply adjusted until resistance disappeared. That was the intellectual hook. Because dangerous men rarely force obedience immediately. They remove every alternative first. "You're afraid of me," Adrian said calmly. Not a question, an observation. Elena forced herself to meet his eyes despite the tension tightening inside her chest. Shouldn't I be? For the first time that evening, something almost resembling amusement touched Adrian's expression. Not warmth, recognition, as if fear was a response he expected from people naturally. That realization disturbed Elena deeply, because people who normalized fear usually created it everywhere they went. That was the emotional hook, because the most dangerous men are often the ones who mistake fear for respect. Adrian walked slowly toward the large bedroom windows, overlooking the state grounds below. Security guards moved quietly near the front entrance, while black vehicles waited outside beneath glowing lights. Everything around Adrian operated with precision. People obeyed him automatically, not because they admired him, because disappointing him carried consequences nobody wanted to experience. Elena had noticed that immediately after their engagement became public. Servants lowered their eyes whenever Adrian entered rooms. Politicians suddenly became careful with their language around him. Wealthy businessmen who publicly appeared untouchable spoke cautiously in private whenever his name surfaced. Fear followed Adrian naturally, and somehow he seemed completely comfortable inside it. That was the intellectual hook. Because men raised around violence eventually stopped recognizing how terrifying they become to ordinary people. Adrian turned back toward Elena slowly. "You still think this marriage can be stopped?" Elena crossed her arms tightly. "I know it should be." His gaze remained fixed on her calmly. "Your father already agreed." "That doesn't mean I did." Silence settled heavily between them after that. But unlike Elena, Adrian never looked uncomfortable inside silence. He used silence strategically, to pressure, to observe, to dominate conversations without raising his voice. That was the emotional hook, because controlling people understand that silence can intimidate more effectively than anger. "Elena," Adrian said quietly, "you confuse choice with reality." The sentence sent cold frustration through her immediately, because that was exactly how he viewed the world. Not emotionally, structurally. People either accepted reality or suffered against it. That was the intellectual hook, because controlling men often believe power itself creates moral correctness. Adrian finally moved toward the bedroom door again before stopping briefly beside the wedding dress. "You'll be ready tomorrow evening." Then he left. No argument, no discussion, just certainty. And somehow that certainty frightened Elena more than open threats ever could, because Adrian Vale behaved like a man who had never truly heard the word no before. That was the emotional hook, because people become terrifying once life stops denying them anything. The following morning, the city woke beneath headlines celebrating the upcoming marriage between the Whitmore political dynasty and Adrian Vale's business empire. News stations described the wedding as historic, elegant, powerful. Nobody described it honestly. Transactional. That was the intellectual hook. Because society often glamorizes dangerous power, as long as wealth surrounds attractively enough. Across the city, Adrian sat inside the top floor of the Vale Financial Tower, overlooking downtown traffic far below. Massive glass windows surrounded his private office, while armed security remained stationed discreetly outside every entrance. The office reflected Adrian perfectly. Minimalistic, expensive, cold. Nothing personal existed inside the room except control. That was the emotional hook, because environments usually reveal the emotional state of the people who built them. Several men waited nervously near the conference table, while Adrian reviewed financial reports silently. Nobody interrupted him unnecessarily. Nobody moved carelessly. Even experienced criminals became cautious around Adrian, because unlike emotional mob bosses driven by ego or rage, Adrian operated differently. Strategically, that made him harder to predict, and far more dangerous. That was the intellectual hook. Because calm intelligence creates longer-lasting fear than uncontrolled violence. One of his associates finally spoke carefully. The port situation has been handled. Adrian lowered the file slightly, and the judge transferred exactly as requested. Adrian nodded once. Simple, efficient, entire system shifted quietly whenever he decided they should. Ports, judges, politicians, police investigations. Money moved through his influence like blood, through veins beneath the city itself. Legally on the surface, corrupt underneath. That was the emotional hook. Because the most dangerous empires are the ones hidden behind legitimate success. People publicly called Adrian a businessman because nobody could prove anything else. But privately, everyone understood the truth. His empire survived through fear disguised as order. Adrian built power by learning one lesson early in life. Control prevented suffering. Or at least, that was what he convinced himself. That was the intellectual hook. Because people shaped by trauma often turn survival instincts into personality. Years earlier, Adrian grew up inside another mansion equally filled with wealth and emotional emptiness. His father, Victor Vale, ruled the family through violence hidden beneath expensive appearances. Weakness received punishment. Emotion received humiliation. Love never existed inside the Vale household. Only obedience. Adrian learned very young that control protected him from pain. So he mastered control completely. That was the emotional hook. Because children raised without love often confuse domination with safety later in life. At 12 years old, Adrian watched his father beat a trusted employee unconscious, simply for making an accounting mistake. Nobody intervened. Nobody questioned it afterward. The employee disappeared the next day. And Adrian learned another lesson. Fear created loyalty faster than kindness ever could. That belief followed him into adulthood, into business, into relationships, into everything. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotionally damaged people often rebuild the same cruelty they once survived. Now the city feared Adrian the same way Adrian once feared his own father. The cycle completed itself perfectly. But unlike Victor Vale, Adrian refined his brutality into elegance. He rarely lost control publicly because public chaos weakened authority. Instead, Adrian preferred quiet consequences, destroyed careers, financial collapse, disappearances no newspaper fully explained. He made examples out of people privately, so the public never needed reminders twice. That was the emotional hook, because psychological fear lasts longer than physical violence. Later that afternoon, Adrian attended a private business gathering inside one of the city's luxury hotels. Politicians, investors, and corporate executives moved through the ballroom carefully while expensive music played softly overhead. The moment Adrian entered, conversations subtly shifted. People smiled faster, straightened posture, adjusted behavior instinctively. Elena noticed that same reaction constantly around him now. Nobody challenged Adrian directly, not because they respected him. Because powerful men surviving through fear eventually trained entire environments around their presence. That was the intellectual hook. Because fear becomes culture once enough people adapt to it silently. One politician approached Adrian nervously near the bar. There were concerns about tomorrow's security arrangements. Adrian looked at him once. Just once. The politician immediately corrected himself. Not concerns. Adjustments. Adrian nodded calmly. Handle it. The man left instantly. Watching the interaction unsettled even Adrian's own associates sometimes. Because Adrian never needed to threaten people openly anymore. His reputation handled intimidation automatically. That was the emotional hook. Because the most feared people no longer need to explain consequences. Yet despite all his control over the city, Elena Whitmore remained the one variable Adrian could not fully manage, and that fascinated him dangerously. Most women around Adrian adapted quickly to wealth and influence. They admired power, feared it perhaps, but accepted it. Elena resisted it, not dramatically, quietly, constantly. She looked at Adrian like she saw something beneath the expensive suits and polished calmness, something darker that irritated him, but also obsessed him. because Adrian rarely encountered people who resisted his influence naturally. That was the intellectual hook, because controlling personalities become addicted to the people they cannot fully dominate. By evening, Adrian returned to the Whitmore estate for final wedding preparations. Staff moved nervously throughout the mansion, while luxury decorations transformed the property into something resembling a political palace. Everything looked perfect externally. Inside, Elena felt panic growing stronger every hour. She stood near the staircase, watching workers carry floral arrangements through the hallway, while her father discussed security details downstairs. Nobody noticed her emotionally disappearing in front of them. That loneliness hurt more than fear sometimes, because nobody inside the mansion truly asked whether she was okay anymore, only whether she was prepared. That was the emotional hook, because trapped people often become invisible inside systems built to control them. Adrian noticed Elena immediately upon entering the hallway. She wore a simple cream-colored dress with her hair tied loosely behind her shoulders. No jewelry, except the engagement ring she hated touching. Beautiful, controlled, distant. Adrian walked toward her slowly while conversations nearby quieted automatically around them. Elena! She forced herself to remain steady. I don't want this. The sentence came quietly. Honestly, one final attempt at freedom. Adrian studied her face carefully. You'll adapt. Those 3 words nearly shattered something inside her, not because they sounded cruel, because he genuinely believed them. That was the intellectual hook, because emotionally disconnected people often mistake survival for happiness. You think fear creates loyalty, Elena whispered. Adrian's expression remained unreadable. Fear creates stability. And what creates love? For the first time, Adrian paused slightly. Not long, but enough, because nobody asked him questions like that. Not honestly, not without fear. That was the emotional hook, because emotionally damaged people struggle most with emotions they cannot control logically. Adrian finally answered quietly. Love makes people weak. Elena looked at him then with something deeper than fear. Sadness. Real sadness. Because she suddenly understood the terrifying truth about Adrian Vale. He did not understand love at all. Only possession. That was the intellectual hook. Because the loneliest people are often the ones who believe control can replace emotional connection. That realization changed how Elena saw him entirely. Not softer, more tragic. Adrian wasn't forcing this marriage because he loved her. He was forcing it because her resistance made him feel something unfamiliar, loss of control. And Adrian Vale would destroy entire worlds before accepting loss of control. That was the emotional hook. Because obsessive people often chase ownership when what they truly fear is rejection. Later that night, Elena entered her bedroom slowly after the final guest departed downstairs. And there it was, the wedding dress, waiting silently near the window beneath soft golden light. Massive, beautiful, terrifying. The expensive white fabric looked untouched and perfect, while rain began tapping softly against the distant windows outside. Elena walked toward it carefully, like approaching evidence of her own imprisonment. Then she noticed something beside the dress. A velvet jewelry box. Inside rested a diamond necklace expensive enough to buy entire houses. Beneath it, a handwritten note from Adrian. Tomorrow changes everything. No affection, no warmth, just certainty again. That certainty finally broke something inside Elena completely, because she realized the truth now with painful clarity. Nobody planned on asking for her agreement anymore. The marriage was happening whether she accepted it or not. And somewhere deep inside the mansion, preparations had already begun for a wedding she no longer knew how to escape. The dress looked beautiful, but to her, it felt like surrender stitched into white fabric. Morning arrived over the Whitmore estate like the beginning of a performance nobody was allowed to stop. Luxury vehicles filled the circular driveway before sunrise, while workers moved rapidly across the massive property carrying flowers, lighting equipment, champagne crates, and expensive decorations. Security teams monitored every entrance with military precision, while media vans gathered outside the state gates, hoping to capture glimpses of the wedding everyone in the city was already calling historic. Inside the mansion, everything looked elegant, perfect, controlled. Elena Whitmore felt like she was disappearing inside it. That was the emotional hook, because forced obedience destroys people long before the wedding even begins. She stood silently in front of her bedroom mirror, while professional stylists prepared cosmetics beside her. White roses filled the room with soft fragrance, while expensive jewelry rested across velvet displays nearby. The wedding dress waited near the windows like a final decision already made for her. Heavy white fabric, hand-sewn diamonds, luxury worth more than most people earned in years. But Elena did not see beauty anymore when she looked at it. She saw ownership. That was the intellectual hook. Because symbols become terrifying once people lose the freedom to reject them. The women helping prepare her avoided personal conversation completely. They smiled politely, worked quietly, never asked if she was happy. Everyone inside the mansion already understood an invisible rule: do not interfere, especially not with Adrian Vale. That silence isolated Elena more than direct cruelty ever could, because fear had infected everyone around her so deeply that even sympathy became dangerous. That was the emotional hook, because people trapped by powerful systems often suffer most from everyone else's silence. Outside her bedroom door, the mansion buzzed with controlled chaos. Politicians arrived early for private meetings downstairs. Security coordinators adjusted guest routes constantly. Luxury catering teams moved through the hallways, carrying trays beneath crystal lights. The wedding had become larger than Elena herself now. A political alliance, a business statement, a display of power disguised as romance. Nobody cared whether the bride actually wanted to marry the groom. That was the intellectual hook, because elite society often transforms human lives into strategic performances. Elena's mother entered quietly sometime after noon, wearing an elegant silver dress prepared for the ceremony. Victoria Whitmore looked exhausted beneath carefully applied makeup, though years of political life taught her how to hide discomfort gracefully. "Elena," she said softly, "the photographers will arrive soon." Elena stared at her reflection, without reacting immediately. "I still have time to leave." The sentence sounded almost emotionless now. Not dramatic, not desperate, just tired. Victoria closed the bedroom door carefully behind her before stepping closer. "You need to stop thinking like that." Elena finally turned slowly. "Why?" "Because it embarrasses Dad." Her mother's expression tightened painfully. "No, because Adrian Vale doesn't lose things that belong to him." The words chilled the room instantly, because even now, even privately, her mother described Elena like property. That was the emotional hook, because people living under fear eventually stop recognizing how cruel their language becomes. Elena looked away toward the wedding dress again. "I'm not his—" Victoria remained silent for several seconds before answering quietly. That stopped mattering once the agreement was made. The honesty inside the statement hurt worse than lies, because Elena realized something devastating then. Nobody inside the mansion believed escape was truly possible anymore. Not even her mother. That was the intellectual hook, because hopelessness spreads quietly through families long before people admit defeat aloud. After Victoria left, Elena moved toward the bedroom balcony, overlooking the state grounds below. Luxury cars continued arriving beneath gray afternoon skies, while security teams checked guest lists at every entrance. Far beyond the estate gates, reporters crowded against barriers hoping to capture photographs of Adrian Vale and Elena Whitmore together. The media described the wedding like a modern fairy tale. Powerful businessman, political dynasty, elegant ceremony. Nobody understood the truth behind the expensive images. That was the emotional hook, because wealth hides suffering more effectively than poverty ever could. Elena gripped the balcony railing tightly, while rain clouds gathered slowly over the distant city skyline. Escape, the word repeated constantly inside her thoughts now. Not fantasy anymore. Calculation. She studied guard patterns repeatedly over the last 12 hours. Security shifted every 30 minutes near the west entrance. Service vehicles moved to the lower gates during catering deliveries. Cameras covered most exterior areas except portions of the garden path behind the estate greenhouse. Small details, small possibilities. That was the intellectual hook, because trapped people become experts at searching for openings others never notice. But another terrifying truth haunted her too. Even if she escaped the mansion, where would she go? Adrian's influence stretched through the entire city. Police chiefs attended his private dinners. Judges owed him favors. Business owners feared his retaliation. Men like Adrian did not merely control buildings. They controlled systems. That was the emotional hook. Because true power becomes terrifying once escape itself starts feeling impossible. A sudden knock interrupted her thoughts again. Not soft, controlled. Elena already knew who it was before the door opened. Adrian Vale entered alone wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, while distant thunder rolled faintly outside. His calmness remained untouched despite the chaos surrounding the estate. That calmness always unsettled her, especially now, because while everyone else rushed nervously preparing for the wedding, Adrian looked completely certain already, as if the future had been decided long ago. That was the intellectual hook, because controlling people appear most dangerous when they stop questioning outcomes entirely. His eyes moved briefly toward the wedding dress before settling on Elena. You haven't tried it on yet. Not anger. Observation again. Elena folded her arms tightly. I don't need to. Adrian stepped farther, inside the room slowly. You'll wear it tonight. Every conversation with him felt identical eventually. Not discussions. Conclusions. That was the emotional hook. Because emotionally controlling people speak about the future, like other people's choices no longer exist. Elena stared at him carefully. Do you ever hear yourself? Adrian's expression barely shifted. I hear hesitation. You hear obedience because that's all people around you are allowed to give. The sentence lingered sharply between them. Most people feared speaking honestly to Adrian. Elena didn't, and that honesty continued pulling his attention toward her in dangerous ways. That was the intellectual hook, because controlling personalities become obsessed with people they cannot emotionally dominate. Adrian walked toward the large windows overlooking the estate below. Fear keeps systems stable. Elena almost laughed hearing that. Fear destroys people. Adrian looked back at her calmly. Destroyed people are predictable. The answer sent cold realization through her instantly, because Adrian truly believed emotional control protected everyone involved. That was the emotional hook, because damaged people often justify cruelty by calling it stability. For a moment, silence settled heavily between them, while rain finally began tapping softly against the windows outside. Then Elena asked a question she had avoided for months. Would you still want this marriage if I actually loved someone else? Adrian became completely still. The room itself seemed to tighten around the silence afterward. That reaction alone gave Elena her answer, because possessive men fear replacement more than rejection. That was the intellectual hook, because obsession is often rooted less in love and more in ownership. Adrian finally spoke quietly. You don't. The certainty inside his voice frightened her again, not because he sounded emotional, because he sounded absolute, as if her feelings themselves no longer mattered. That was the emotional hook, because the scariest people are the ones who believe they understand your life better than you do. When Adrian finally left the room again, Elena's composure collapsed completely for the first time all day. She sat near the edge of the bed staring at the wedding dress while distant voices echoed through the mansion downstairs. Everything felt unreal now. The flowers, the cameras, the expensive fabric, the political guests. All of it existed around a ceremony she never truly agreed to. And the worst part, nobody was coming to stop it. That realization hollowed something inside her. That was the intellectual hook. Because people lose hope completely the moment they realize rescue is never arriving. Hours passed slowly after that. Stylists returned. Jewelry arrived. Photographers prepared downstairs. The estate transformed into a glowing spectacle beneath gathering storm clouds, while television stations broadcast live coverage from outside the gates. Elena Whitmore and Adrian Vale are expected to begin the ceremony shortly after sunset. The distant television voice made her physically sick. A ceremony, like this was normal, like she wasn't emotionally drowning inside the middle of it. That was the emotional hook. Because society often romanticizes women's suffering when wealth makes it visually attractive. As evening approached, servants finally helped Elena into the wedding dress. The heavy white fabric settled around her body like something restrictive instead of elegant. Diamonds shimmered softly beneath golden lights, while layers of expensive material dragged across the polished floor behind her. Beautiful, sophisticated, empty. Elena barely recognized herself in the mirror afterward, not because she looked different, because she looked erased. That was the intellectual hook. Because forced roles slowly destroy personal identity. Outside the bedroom windows, thunder cracked sharply across the darkening sky, while rain intensified against the estate ground below. The storm arrived fast. Violent wind bent trees across the property, while distant lightning illuminated the massive mansion in cold flashes. Servants rushed nervously through hallways adjusting schedules, while security teams monitored weather reports downstairs. Everything inside the estate suddenly felt unstable, chaotic, and for the first time all day, Elena saw possibility again. That was the emotional hook, because desperate people become dangerous the moment hope returns unexpectedly. One of the stylists left briefly to answer a phone call. Another disappeared downstairs for updated instructions. For the first time since morning, Elena stood alone, completely alone. The storm outside intensified violently now. Rain hammered against the windows, while wind rattled balcony doors sharply. Elena's breathing quickened. This was it. Not a perfect chance, but perhaps the only chance she would ever get. That was the intellectual hook. Because freedom rarely arrives in perfect conditions, it arrives through risk. She moved immediately, fast, controlled. Her hands trembled while pulling the heavy wedding heels from her feet. The expensive shoes dropped silently onto the carpet beside the bed. Barefoot, the cold marble floor shocked her skin instantly. Then she grabbed nothing else. No jewelry, no luggage, no money, because trapped people eventually understand something important. Freedom matters more than comfort. That was the emotional hook, because escape becomes easier once people stop caring what they lose behind them. Lightning flashed violently across the room as Elena pushed open the balcony doors against powerful wind. Rain exploded inside immediately, soaking the white wedding dress within seconds. Cold air struck her skin sharply. But underneath the fear, something else appeared too. Relief. Real relief. That was the intellectual hook. Because sometimes freedom first feels like terror. Elena climbed carefully onto the wet balcony railing, before lowering herself toward the narrow garden ledge beneath. The soaked dress dragged heavily against her legs while thunder cracked again overhead. One mistake could kill her, but staying felt worse. That was the emotional hook. Because people only risk everything once remaining trapped becomes unbearable. Far below, security guards remained distracted near the main ceremony entrance while luxury guests hurried inside away from the storm. Nobody looked upward. Nobody expected the bride to run. Especially not Adrian Vale. That realization gave Elena enough courage to move. She jumped from the ledge into the rain-soaked garden below, stumbling painfully into wet grass as freezing rain covered her instantly. The white wedding dress dragged through mud while thunder roared across the estate. But Elena kept moving, barefoot, terrified, free. For the first time in months, she was running toward her own decision instead of someone else's. And somewhere inside the glowing mansion behind her, people were about to realize the bride had disappeared into the middle of the storm. She ran through the rain without knowing where to go, only knowing she could not belong to him. The storm swallowed Elena Whitmore almost immediately after she escaped the estate grounds. Rain crashed violently against the city, while thunder rolled across the skyline hard enough to shake windows and silence streets. Water soaked through the expensive wedding dress within minutes, turning layers of white fabric heavy against her body as she ran barefoot through mud, broken pavement, and empty side roads far below the Whitmore mansion. She had no plan, no destination, only instinct. Run. That was the emotional hook, because desperate freedom is often driven by fear instead of certainty. Elena's breathing burned painfully inside her chest, while freezing rain blurred her vision. The expensive dress dragged behind her like the remains of life she no longer wanted. Her bare feet struck rough pavement repeatedly, sharp stones slicing against soft skin and used the real city beneath luxury estates and guarded vehicles. But pain no longer mattered, not compared to staying. That was the intellectual hook. Because trapped people eventually stop fearing discomfort once emotional imprisonment becomes unbearable. Behind her, far up the hill, The Whitmore estate glowed beneath flashes of lightning like a palace built for someone else's nightmare. Somewhere inside it, guests still waited beneath chandeliers and expensive flowers, waiting for a bride who had vanished. Elena almost laughed thinking about it. The city's most powerful people sitting politely inside a wedding ceremony, while the woman they celebrated ran barefoot through a storm trying to escape the groom. That irony felt almost unreal. That was the emotional hook, because powerful people often confuse appearances with reality until reality finally humiliates them publicly. She turned sharply into a narrow side street lined with old brick buildings, while distant sirens echoed somewhere farther downtown. Water rushed through gutters heavily around her ankles as cold wind whipped her soaked hair across her face. For the first time in years, nobody controlled where she moved. Nobody decided where she stood. Nobody watched her every expression. The realization felt terrifying and strangely beautiful. That was the intellectual hook, because freedom initially feels frightening to people who spent too long being controlled. Meanwhile, back at the Whitmore estate, panic spread quietly through the mansion. Not public panic, controlled panic. The kind wealthy people use when disasters threaten reputation. Security teams searched hallways rapidly while staff whispered nervously behind closed doors. Politicians adjusted their voices carefully. Media coordinators stalled reporters outside the estate gates with false delays about weather complications. But inside Elena's empty bedroom, the truth already existed. The bride was gone. That was the emotional hook, because some disappearances destroy order faster than violence ever could. Adrian Vale stood near the center of the room in complete silence while rain battered the windows behind him. The wedding dress train still stretched partly across the floor, muddy near the balcony doors where Elena escaped moments earlier. Nobody inside the room dared speak first. Not the security man. Not Elena's father. Nobody. Because Adrian's silence had become more frightening than anger. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotionally controlled men become terrifying once something finally slips beyond their control. Richard Whitmore wiped nervous sweat from his forehead, despite the cold atmosphere. She couldn't have gone far. Adrian didn't respond immediately. His gray eyes remained fixed on the rainwater staining the marble balcony floor. Then, finally, she planned this. The sentence came quietly, calmly, which made everyone more afraid. That was the emotional hook. Because calmness during betrayal usually means obsession is replacing emotion. One of Adrian's security directors stepped forward cautiously. We're already checking cameras and vehicle routes. Adrian slowly looked toward him. No police. The man nodded instantly. Of course, because involving official law enforcement would create public scandal. And Adrian preferred control over publicity. That was the intellectual hook. Because powerful men trust their own systems more than legal ones. Within minutes, the city itself quietly shifted around Elena's disappearance. Black SUVs spread across major intersections. Private surveillance networks activated through businesses secretly connected to Adrian's organization. Hotel managers received photographs. Transportation routes were monitored. Security footage from nearby traffic cameras began filtering directly into Vale Operations Centers downtown, all for one woman. That level of response frightened even Adrian's own men, because it revealed something dangerous. This was no longer about the wedding. It had become personal. That was the emotional hook, because controlling men become most dangerous after public rejection. Adrian returned to the balcony slowly while thunder shook the mansion again overhead. Rain hit his black suit sharply as he stared into the dark city below. Elena had run, not argued, not resisted verbally. Run, like she feared him enough to throw herself into a violent storm barefoot rather than stay beside him. That realization settled coldly inside him. Not anger first. Something worse. Betrayal. That was the intellectual hook. Because obsessive people often interpret rejection as personal disloyalty instead of emotional truth. Across the city, Elena stumbled through unfamiliar streets she had never truly seen before. For years, her world existed inside protected environments. Luxury schools, political events, chauffeured cars, private estates, exclusive restaurants. The real city remained distant from her life. Now she moved directly through it for the first time completely alone. And suddenly the world looked different outside privilege. That was the emotional hook. Because people raised inside wealth often discover reality only after losing protection. Small convenience stores glowed weakly beneath broken neon signs. Homeless men slept beneath bus shelters trying to escape the storm. Women hurried through rain carrying grocery bags, while exhausted workers waited near late-night train stations. Ordinary life, difficult life, real life. Elena watched everything through freezing exhaustion while hiding beneath the awning of a closed pharmacy. That was the intellectual hook, because hunted people eventually recognized danger through sound before sight. Elena pushed herself harder through the rain-soaked alley despite burning pain, shooting through her bare feet. Her breathing became uneven again while thunder cracked overhead. Then a familiar voice cut through the storm behind her. Elena! Calm, controlled, terrifying. She stopped moving instantly, because hearing Adrian's voice out here, in the middle of the city, soaked by rain, completely alone, made reality crash back into her violently. He found her. That was the emotional hook. Because freedom feels fragile the moment the person you escaped finally catches up to you. Slowly, Elena turned. Adrian stood several feet away beneath the rain, wearing a dark coat, soaked at the shoulders while city lights reflected across wet pavement around him. Security vehicles remained farther down the street, but Adrian approached her alone. No guard beside him, no shouting, no visible anger. And somehow, that frightened her more, because Adrian did not look furious. He looked wounded, betrayed. That expression unsettled Elena deeply, because it revealed something she never expected. Adrian genuinely believed she belonged with him. That was the intellectual hook. Because obsessive people often confuse possession with emotional connection. Rain fell heavily between them, while Elena struggled to breathe through exhaustion. Her wedding dress hung ruined and soaked against her body. Her feet bled openly against the pavement. Her hands trembled violently from cold and fear. And Adrian stared at her like someone looking at a disaster he still couldn't fully understand. Not because she escaped, because she wanted to. That realization darkened his expression in ways anger never could. And standing there beneath the storm, Elena suddenly realized something terrifying. Adrian Vale was no longer chasing her simply to force the wedding. He was chasing her because her rejection had become personal. He was not chasing her because she escaped. He was chasing her because losing her awakened something broken inside him. The drive back to Vale Estate happened in complete silence. Rain continued sliding across the black windows while the city lights blurred into distorted reflections around Elena Whitmore's exhausted face. Her soaked wedding dress clung heavily to her body, and every movement sent sharp pain to the cuts beneath her bare feet. But strangely, Adrian Vale never touched her. He sat across from her inside the luxury vehicle with rigid composure, his gray eyes fixed occasionally toward the rain outside instead of directly at her. That unsettled Elena more than anger would have, because she expected punishment. Instead, she found restraint. That was the emotional hook, because emotionally damaged people often become unpredictable the moment genuine feelings interfere with control. The silence inside the vehicle felt painfully fragile, not peaceful. Careful, like both of them understood something had shifted during the storm. Elena escaped. Adrian found her. But the moment did not end the way either of them expected. That was the intellectual hook. Because reality becomes complicated once fear and emotional attachment begin existing together. When the vehicle finally entered the estate gates again, security teams quietly stepped aside without speaking. Nobody looked directly at Elena. Nobody acknowledged a ruined wedding dress or the blood beneath her feet. The entire mansion had transformed overnight. No wedding guests, no music, no decorations, only silence. The ceremony no longer mattered. Adrian's attention had narrowed into something far more personal. That was the emotional hook. Because obsession intensifies once public appearances stop mattering. Elena expected guards outside her room afterward. Locked doors. Punishment. Instead, Adrian gave only one calm instruction before leaving her near the staircase. Get medical treatment for her feet. Nothing else. No threats. No accusations. No discussion about the wedding. That restraint disturbed Elena deeply, because she no longer understood what Adrian was thinking. That was the intellectual hook, because emotionally controlled people become hardest to predict once emotions finally break through their structure. Hours later, Elena sat alone inside a guest suite overlooking the eastern gardens while bandages wrapped carefully around both feet. Morning sunlight filtered softly through tall windows, exposing emotional exhaustion beneath her reflection. She barely recognized herself now. The expensive wedding dress had been replaced with soft cream-colored clothing left silently outside the bathroom door. Her hair remained damp from the storm. Her eyes looked hollow from fear, confusion, and sleeplessness. But beneath all of it, another feeling had started forming. Questions. That was the emotional hook. Because fear changes once people begin noticing humanity inside the person they escaped. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Elena immediately stiffened. Then Adrian entered quietly without waiting for a response. He looked different in daylight, still controlled, still intimidating. But exhaustion darkened the sharpness beneath his expression now. His black dress shirt remained partially unbuttoned at the collar, and faint shadows beneath his eyes suggested he had not slept either. For several seconds neither spoke. The silence between them no longer felt simple. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotional tension becomes dangerous once silence starts carrying meaning. Adrian's gaze lowered briefly toward the bandages around her feet. You should have worn shoes. The sentence sounded strangely calm, almost practical. Elena stared at him in disbelief. That's what you took from all this? His jaw tightened slightly. You could have seriously injured yourself. The answer unsettled her completely, because Adrian sounded more disturbed by her injuries than her escape itself. That was the emotional hook, because possessive people often interpret harm to others as personal emotional damage. Elena crossed her arms tightly. You forced me into that situation. Adrian remained silent briefly, not defensive, thinking. That alone surprised her, because she expected denial. Instead, he looked almost inflicted. That was the intellectual hook, because emotionally damaged people struggle most when forced to confront their own behavior honestly. Finally, Adrian moved toward the large windows overlooking the estate grounds. You think I wanted to scare you? Elena laughed softly without humor. You terrified me. The words settled heavily into the room. Adrian looked away slightly after hearing them, and for the first time since meeting him, Elena saw something unexpected beneath his composure. Pain, small, quickly hidden, but real. That was the emotional hook, because powerful people often hide emotional wounds beneath control instead of vulnerability. Days passed differently after the failed wedding. Adrian no longer forced public wedding discussions. The mansion returned to controlled quiet, while business meetings resumed across the estate. But something inside Adrian's behavior had changed subtly. Less pressure, less direct control, more distance. That shift confused Elena deeply, because she expected obsession to become harsher after her escape. Instead, Adrian seemed internally divided. That was the intellectual hook, because genuine emotional attachment often weakens rigid control patterns. Elena started noticing things she ignored before. The way staff members avoided sudden movements around Adrian. How silence immediately spread whenever his mood darkened. The way people obeyed him before instructions fully finished. Fear surrounded him naturally, not because he shouted, because everyone believed disappointing him carried consequences. That realization slowly changed how Elena viewed him. Adrian did not create control randomly. He depended on it emotionally. That was the emotional hook, because people obsessed with control are usually terrified of losing something deeper inside themselves. One evening, Elena wandered accidentally into the West Wing library while searching for a quieter part of the mansion. The room remained dimly lit beneath warm afternoon sunlight, lined with dark shelves and old leather furniture untouched by most of the household. She almost turned back until she noticed Adrian sitting alone near the fireplace, not working, not speaking, just staring silently at an old photograph resting loosely in his hand. Elena stopped instinctively, because something about the moment felt private in a way she had never seen from him before. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotionally guarded people reveal themselves most accidentally during solitude. Adrian noticed her presence several seconds later, but didn't immediately hide the photograph. That surprised her. Then she saw it clearly. A young boy standing beside a woman with tired eyes and visible bruises near her wrist. Adrian and his mother. The image changed something inside Elena instantly. That was the emotional hook. Because understanding someone's childhood often changes the way their cruelty appears. Adrian lowered the photograph, slowly. She stayed too long. Elena frowned slightly. "What?" "My mother." His voice remained calm, but emotionally distant in the way people spoke about memories they never processed properly. She married a violent man because leaving would have embarrassed the family. Elena went still immediately, because suddenly everything felt connected. The control, the obsession, the fear of rejection. That was the intellectual hook. Because childhood trauma often repeats itself through different forms of emotional damage. Adrian looked back toward the fireplace, quietly. She thought obedience would make him kinder eventually. Elena's chest tightened painfully. What happened to her? A long silence followed. Then, she died believing fear was love. The sentence hollowed the room completely. Not dramatic, not emotional, just factual, which somehow made it worse. That was the emotional hook. Because emotionally neglected children often learn love through pain first. Elena stared at Adrian carefully now. For years she imagined him as emotionally empty. But emptiness was not what existed inside him. Damage existed instead. Deep damage. That realization frightened her differently. Because damaged men could become either dangerous or human. That was the intellectual hook. Because trauma does not automatically create monsters, but unresolved trauma often creates harmful people. Adrian leaned back slightly, eyes distant now. My father controlled everything. The house, the business, the people around him. His jaw tightened subtly. Control was survival in that house. Elena remained silent, because for the first time, Adrian was speaking without intimidation, without performance. Just truth. That was the emotional hook. Because honesty feels unfamiliar, coming from people who built their lives around emotional armor. He used fear constantly, Adrian continued quietly. And eventually I realized something important. Elena watched him carefully. Fear works. The statement chilled her instantly, because now she understood the foundation beneath everything Adrian became. That was the intellectual hook. Because children often inherit the emotional methods that once hurt them most. Adrian finally looked directly at her again. When people fear leaving you, they stay. Elena's breathing slowed. That isn't love. A shadow crossed Adrian's expression briefly. No, he admitted quietly. It isn't. That answer shook her more than denial would have. Because somewhere beneath all the control, Adrian already knew he was broken. That was the emotional hook. Because self-awareness becomes painful once damaged people recognize the harm they create. After that conversation, Elena started noticing moments she previously ignored. The way Adrian dismissed staff whenever she looked uncomfortable. How security around her quietly loosened over time. The fact he no longer locked certain areas of the mansion. Small changes, careful changes, but intentional. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotionally damaged people rarely change dramatically. They change through restraint first. Elena remained cautious. She still feared him, still feared the power surrounding his name. But sympathy had started mixing dangerously with fear now, and that emotional confusion unsettled her deeply. Because understanding someone's pain does not erase the damage they cause. That was the emotional hook. Because compassion becomes dangerous once it starts softening fear. Meanwhile, Adrian struggled privately with emotions he no longer controlled cleanly. Elena escaping affected him more deeply than he expected. Not because she embarrassed him publicly. Because watching her run to the storm awakened memories he spent years burying. His mother, crying quietly behind locked bedroom doors. People leaving. Abandonment. Powerlessness. And suddenly Adrian understood something terrifying about himself. He was not forcing Elena to stay, because he loved her correctly. He was forcing her to stay because losing her triggered every broken part of him. That realization disturbed him deeply. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotionally damaged people often confuse attachment with emotional survival. One night, Adrian found Elena sitting alone near the garden terrace, reading quietly beneath soft evening light. He stopped several feet away. "You're not asking to leave anymore." Elena closed the book slowly. "That doesn't mean I stop wanting freedom." Adrian nodded once. "I know." The answer came too quickly, too honestly. That surprised her. That was the emotional hook. Because emotionally controlling people struggle most when they begin respecting another person's emotions. Elena studied him carefully. "You don't know how to love people without controlling them." Adrian's gaze lowered briefly toward the gardens. "No." Again, honesty. Raw and uncomfortable. That honesty slowly became harder for Elena to hate. That frightened her more than his anger ever did. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotionally wounded people become most dangerous once they start appearing understandable. For several moments, silence stretched softly between them, while warm wind moved through the terrace curtains nearby. Then Adrian said something unexpected. "You were right to run." Elena froze instantly, because hearing those words from him felt almost impossible. That was the emotional hook. Because apologies become powerful when spoken by people incapable of saying them easily. Adrian leaned slightly against the stone railing. "I would have trapped you emotionally the same way my father trapped everyone around him." Elena stared at him quietly. "And now?" A long pause followed. Then finally, "I don't know." That uncertainty felt more real than all his previous confidence combined. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotional healing often begins the moment certainty breaks apart. But while emotional tension between them deepened quietly inside the estate, danger outside it continued growing. Adrian's enemies had noticed the changes around him, the softer decisions, the emotional distractions, the woman suddenly appearing beside him constantly. And men inside criminal worlds understood one thing clearly. Emotion created vulnerability. That was the emotional hook. Because powerful men become weakest the moment someone finally matters to them. Late one evening, Elena accidentally overheard two security men speaking outside the east corridor. They know about her now. Vale's becoming reckless because of the girl. Elijah Mercer's people are already watching the state routes. Elena's stomach tightened instantly. Elijah Mercer, another rival, another dangerous name connected to Adrian's world. And suddenly, understanding hit her hard. She was no longer simply trapped inside Adrian's life. She had become part of his weakness. That realization terrified her completely, because she finally understood something Adrian had not fully admitted yet himself. The moment powerful enemies realized he cared about her, she stopped being protected and became a target. That was the intellectual hook. Because in violent worlds, love quickly transforms into leverage. Elena slowly stepped back in the corridor, fear spreading coldly through her chest, while distant thunder rolled softly beyond the estate windows. And somewhere beyond the safety of the mansion, Adrian's enemies had already begun preparing for war, using her as the vulnerability they believed could finally destroy him. The moment she became important to him, she became dangerous to everyone around him. The atmosphere inside Vale Estate changed quietly after Elena overheard the guards speaking about Adrian's enemies. Nothing looked different on the surface. The marble hallways still reflected morning sunlight through massive windows. Staff members still moved carefully through the mansion with rehearsed silence. Security teams still rotated through checkpoints with military precision. But Elena noticed something new now. Fear, not her fear. Theirs. That was the emotional hook. Because powerful empires become unstable the moment their leader finally has something to lose. Elena stood near the terrace balcony early, the next morning, watching black vehicles move through the estate gates below. Armed men exchanged information near the entrance, while security routes changed repeatedly across the property. Everything felt sharper, more alert, like the mansion itself understood danger was approaching. And somehow, that danger centered around her. That was the intellectual hook. Because people connected to powerful men eventually become targets whether they choose that role or not. Adrian entered the terrace quietly behind her, already dressed in a dark, tailored suit despite the early hour. His expression looked colder than usual, but exhaustion remained visible beneath his composure. He had not slept much. Elena sensed it immediately. That unsettled her more than anger ever could, because tired men made emotional decisions. That was the emotional hook, because exhaustion weakens emotional control faster than violence ever does. "You increase security," Elena said without turning. Adrian stepped beside her slowly. "Yes." The answer came immediately. No denial, no avoidance. That honesty made the tension worse somehow. Elena crossed her arms tightly. "Because your enemies know about me now." Adrian remained silent for several seconds. Then finally, "Yes." Again, truth. That frightened her more than comforting lies. That was the intellectual hook. Because honesty becomes terrifying once people stop pretending danger is temporary. Elena looked toward the armed guards near the gates. "I'm trapped again." Adrian's jaw tightened instantly. "You're protected." That sounds identical. The words hit him harder than she expected, because deep down, he knew she was right. That was the emotional hook, because protection becomes painful once it starts resembling imprisonment. Adrian moved closer toward the railing overlooking the estate grounds. "Elijah Mercer won't approach directly," he said calmly. "He'll look for weakness first." Elena studied him carefully. "And I'm the weakness now." Adrian didn't answer immediately, but silence confirmed enough. That was the intellectual hook, because people become vulnerable the moment someone finally matters emotionally. Over the following days, security around Elena intensified dramatically. 2 guards followed her movements through the estate discreetly but constantly. Vehicles were checked before entering the property. Unknown staff members disappeared overnight after background investigations revealed questionable connections. The mansion no longer felt luxurious. It felt fortified. Elena hated every second of it. That was the emotional hook, because fear destroys comfort long before actual violence begins. She tried walking to the gardens one afternoon only to notice security teams adjusting their positions around her immediately, not subtly, professionally, like protecting her had become part of military strategy. Elena stopped near the fountain in frustration. "I can walk alone." One of the guards lowered his gaze respectfully. Mr. Vale instructed otherwise. Of course he did. Everything still returned to Adrian's control eventually. That realization reignited old anger inside her. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotionally controlling people often recreate cages even while trying to protect someone. That evening, Elena confronted Adrian directly inside his office. The room remained dim beneath soft city light filtering through enormous windows, while reports and security files covered his desk. Adrian looked up immediately when she entered. "You assigned guard to follow me everywhere. They're there for your safety." "I can't even walk through the gardens alone." His expression hardened slightly. "You think this is temporary paranoia?" Elena stepped closer. "I think you're using fear as an excuse to control me again." The accusation settled sharply between them, because part of it was true. That was the emotional hook, because damaged people often hide emotional control behind protection. Adrian leaned back slowly in his chair, studying her carefully. "You heard the guards talking yesterday." Not a question, a realization. Elena's silence confirmed it. Adrian exhaled quietly before standing. "Elijah Mercer doesn't threaten people randomly," he said calmly. "If he sees emotional value somewhere, he attacks it." Elena looked away briefly. "So now my entire life changes because someone dangerous wants leverage against you." Adrian's eyes darkened slightly. "My enemies don't care what you deserve." The sentence carried brutal honesty, and Elena hated how real it sounded. That was the intellectual hook, because criminal worlds punish innocent people for emotional connections they never asked for. Adrian stepped around the desk slowly. "For years I survived because nobody could reach me emotionally." Elena looked back toward him carefully. "And now?" A long silence followed. Then Adrian answered quietly. "Now they can." The admission changed something inside the room instantly, because Adrian Vale rarely admitted vulnerability aloud. That was the emotional hook, because powerful men become terrifyingly human once they acknowledged fear. Days later, the first warning arrived. A black envelope appeared inside Adrian's vehicle after meeting downtown despite heavy security surrounding the convoy. No fingerprints. No cameras capturing placement. Only a single photograph inside. Elena walking through the estate gardens. A sniper's targeting marked position directly over her chest. That was the intellectual hook. Because threats become psychological long before violence turns physical. Adrian stared at the photograph silently for nearly a full minute after receiving it. Then something inside him shifted visibly. Not panic. Rage. Cold rage. The dangerous kind. That was the emotional hook. Because emotionally restrained men become scariest when someone threatens what they love. The estate changed immediately afterward. More guards. More surveillance. More weapons visible openly now. Elena noticed a shift within hours. Men speaking quieter around Adrian. Staff avoiding direct eye contact. Security teams moving with increased urgency. Everyone inside the mansion understood one thing clearly now. Someone had threatened Elena directly, and Adrian Vale was becoming unpredictable because of it. That was the intellectual hook. Because empires built on control begin destabilizing once emotions enter leadership decisions. Elena found Adrian later that night, standing alone near the indoor bar overlooking the city skyline. The photograph rested silently beside an untouched glass of whiskey. She saw it immediately, and her blood turned cold. That was the emotional hook. Because seeing your own death framed as a warning changes fear permanently. Adrian noticed her staring at the image. You weren't supposed to see that. Elena looked up slowly. They're threatening me. They're threatening me through you. The correction came instantly. Possessive, protective, dangerously emotional. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotionally attached people stop separating harm against loved ones from harm against themselves. Elena folded her arms tightly. This is exactly why I never wanted this life. Adrian remained silent, because again, she was right. That silence disturbed her deeply now, because Adrian had stopped defending his world. That was the emotional hook, because self-awareness inside dangerous men creates emotional conflict instead of certainty. They'll stop eventually, Adrian said quietly. Elena stared at him in disbelief. You don't even believe that. No, he didn't, and they both knew it. That was the intellectual hook. Because lies become useless once fear turns realistic. Over the next week, Adrian became more violent toward enemies than Elena had ever seen before. Not publicly, never recklessly, but quietly, efficiently. Warehouses connected to Elijah Mercer disappeared overnight. Financial routes collapsed unexpectedly. Several high-level associates vanished entirely from the city. Adrian was retaliating, and the terrifying part, he was doing it emotionally. That was the emotional hook, because love becomes dangerous once violent men start protecting it personally. Elena noticed a change immediately. The colder silences, the sharper reactions, the way Adrian's patience disappeared whenever her safety became involved. One evening, she entered his office unexpectedly and stopped cold. A bloodied man knelt on the floor surrounded by security personnel, while Adrian stood nearby with terrifying calmness. Nobody noticed Elena immediately, but she noticed enough. Fear spread instantly through her chest, not because Adrian looked violent, because he looked emotionally detached while violence happened around him. That frightened her more. That was the intellectual hook, because the scariest people are often the ones who stay calm during cruelty. Adrian turned toward her sharply the moment he realized she was there. Something changed in his expression instantly. Not embarrassment. Concern. He moved toward her immediately. You shouldn't be here. Elena stepped backward instinctively. For one painful second, she saw the full reality of his empire clearly. Not expensive suits. Not political influence. Violence. Fear. Control maintained through consequences. That was the emotional hook, because romantic illusions collapsed the moment people witnessed the true cost of power. Adrian noticed a fear inside her eyes immediately, and unexpectedly, it hurt him. That realization unsettled him deeply, because years ago fear felt useful. Now Elena's fear felt personal. That was the intellectual hook, because emotional attachment changes how people interpret the reactions they once controlled easily. Elena, she shook her head immediately. This is who you really are. The statement landed brutally, because Adrian no longer knew if he could deny it honestly. That was the emotional hook, because self-hatred begins when people recognize truth inside someone else's fear. Elena left the office quickly afterward, her breathing uneven while memories collided violently inside her thoughts. The storm, the forced wedding, the guards, the threats, the violence she just witnessed, and beneath all of it, the growing realization that Adrian genuinely feared losing her. That emotional contradiction exhausted her completely, because part of him terrified her, and another part, the damaged, emotionally broken part, felt painfully human now. That was the intellectual hook, because emotional complexity becomes dangerous once fear and sympathy begin existing together. Meanwhile, Adrian remained alone inside the office long after everyone else left. The bloodied man had already been removed, the room cleaned, the silence restored. But Elena's expression remained trapped inside his thoughts now. Fear, disappointment, pain, and worst of all, understanding. Because she finally saw exactly what his world truly looked like. That realization hollowed something inside him unexpectedly. That was the emotional hook. Because love becomes unbearable once someone sees your darkest parts clearly. For the first time in years, Adrian questioned his own method seriously. Violence protected power. Fear maintained loyalty. Control prevented betrayal. Those rules built his entire empire. But now another question existed beneath them. What if those same rules destroyed Elena eventually? That thought unsettled him deeply, because he had spent years believing control protected people. Now it looked more like poison. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotionally damaged people often realize too late that survival methods can destroy healthy relationships. 3 nights later, the estate hosted a private political gathering connected to Adrian's business alliances. High-ranking officials, wealthy investors, and powerful families filled the mansion beneath controlled luxury and rehearsed conversation. Elena hated events like this. Everyone smiled too carefully, too strategically. Fear hid beneath elegance constantly. That was the emotional hook, because elite criminal worlds disguised danger beneath sophistication. Adrian remained close to her throughout the evening, subtle but attentive. His eyes tracked exits automatically. Security rotated constantly through the crowd. Elena noticed everything now. The paranoia, the awareness, the pressure surrounding his existence. And for the first time, she saw a genuine fear inside Adrian himself. Not fear for power, fear for her. That realization changed something painfully inside her. That was the intellectual hook. Because genuine fear reveals emotional truth faster than affection ever can. Near midnight, Elena stepped briefly onto one of the eastern balconies for air. Overwhelmed by the suffocating atmosphere inside the mansion, rain clouds moved slowly above the city skyline, while distant music echoed softly from inside. For several seconds, peace existed. Then footsteps approached behind her. Elena turned instinctively, but not fast enough. A gloved hand grabbed her violently from behind, while another covered her mouth instantly. Her body froze in terror. Everything happened too quickly. A sharp object pressed against her ribs. A low voice near her ear. Tell Adrian Vale his enemies finally found something he loves. That was the emotional hook. Because love becomes terrifying the moment enemies realize it exists. Elena struggled violently, panic exploding through her chest while the masked attacker dragged her backward toward the dark balcony exit. Inside the mansion, music still played. Guests still smiled. Nobody noticed. And somewhere deeper inside the estate, Adrian Vale had not realized the first real attack against Elena had already begun before he could protect her. The man who once forced her into a wedding dress was now willing to lose her just to keep her alive. The attack lasted less than 30 seconds. But for Elena Whitmore, those 30 seconds changed everything. The masked man dragged her backward across the balcony, while rain-heavy wind moved violently through the night air. Panic exploded through her chest as she struggled against the grip around her body. Her heart beat so loud it nearly drowned the music still echoing inside the mansion. Then gunfire shattered the silence. Security teams rushed onto the balcony from both directions while the attacker released Elena violently and disappeared into the darkness beyond the estate walls. Everything happened too fast afterward. Voices, movement, weapons drawn, Adrian appearing through the chaos with terrifying speed. And the moment his eyes landed on Elena, something inside him broke visibly. That was the emotional hook. Because fear becomes unbearable once someone you love almost disappears in front of you. Elena barely stayed standing. Her breathing shook uncontrollably while security surrounded the balcony. Torn fabric hung from one sleeve of her dress where the attacker grabbed her, and red marks already darkened beneath her skin. But she was alive, barely untouched physically, emotionally shattered. That was the intellectual hook. Because survival does not erase fear, sometimes it deepens it permanently. Adrian reached her within seconds, stopping directly in front of her with a level of panic Elena had never seen from him before. Not anger, not control. Fear, pure fear. His hands lifted instinctively toward her face before stopping midway, almost like he feared touching her would make the situation more real. Elena! Her name left his mouth quietly, but the emotion behind it shook harder than shouting ever could. That was the emotional hook. Because emotionally guarded men become transparent the moment terror reaches someone they love. Elena stared at him silently. For the first time since entering Adrian's world, she saw complete helplessness inside his eyes. And somehow, that frightened her differently than violence ever had. Because powerful men were never supposed to look powerless. That was the intellectual hook. Because witnessing vulnerability inside dangerous people changes emotional dynamics permanently. The estate transformed into lockdown immediately afterward. Security doubled across every floor. Vehicles blocked all entrances. Armed guards searched surrounding properties through the night, while Adrian's men hunted desperately for whoever orchestrated the attack. But Adrian himself remained near Elena almost constantly, not possessively, protectively. And that difference mattered now. That was the emotional hook. Because love begins changing once protection stops feeling like ownership. Elena barely slept during the following days. Every unexpected sound startled her awake. Every shadow near the windows triggered panic she struggled to control. The attack replayed repeatedly inside her mind. The gloved hand, the voice, the realization that someone wanted to hurt her simply because Adrian cared about her. That truth hollowed something inside her. That was the intellectual hook. Because people connected to violent worlds eventually realize love itself can become dangerous. One rainy evening, Elena sat alone near the library windows wrapped in silence, while thunder rolled softly outside the estate. She didn't hear Adrian enter immediately, but she felt him stop nearby. Careful, quiet, different. That was the emotional hook. Because emotionally damaged people become gentler once guilt replaces control. Adrian studied her for several long seconds before speaking. This happened because of me. The honesty inside the statement surprised her. No excuses, no manipulation, just truth. Elena looked toward the storm outside. Yes, the answer hurt him visibly, but he accepted it anyway. That alone showed how much he had changed. That was the intellectual hook. Because growth begins when people stop defending the damage they caused. Adrian moved closer slowly, though not close enough to pressure her. I spent years believing power protected everything. Elena remained silent. And now, she asked quietly. His jaw tightened slightly. Now I think power destroys everything eventually. The sentence settled heavily between them. Because Adrian Vale was finally questioning the world that built him. That was the emotional hook. Because transformation becomes real the moment people start doubting the systems that once defined them. For several moments, only rain filled the silence. Then Adrian said something Elena never expected to hear. You can leave. Her breathing paused instantly. What? He met her eyes directly. I'll arrange new identities. New security. Anywhere you want. Elena stared at him in disbelief. Because months ago, Adrian forced her toward marriage-like possession. Now, he was offering freedom. Real freedom. That was the intellectual hook. Because real love begins the moment control becomes optional. You let me go? She asked softly. Adrian looked away briefly toward the storm-dark gardens. If staying near me keeps putting your life at risk. The sentence remained unfinished. But Elena understood the rest. He would lose her if it meant keeping her alive. That realization changed something painfully deep inside her. That was the emotional hook. Because sacrifice reveals love more honestly than obsession ever can. Over the following weeks, Adrian changed in ways nobody around him expected. Meetings with violent associates became shorter. Illegal financial operations quietly disappeared from several districts. Arms routes connected to his organization were dismantled systematically. Not publicly, but intentionally. Adrian was reducing the empire piece by piece. And everyone noticed. That was the intellectual hook. Because people built around power rarely walk away from it voluntarily. His inner circle reacted badly. Especially Luca Mero, one of Adrian's oldest advisors. "You're weakening the organization," Luca warned during a late-night meeting inside the estate office. Adrian remained calm behind the desk. "I'm removing unnecessary exposure." Luca's expression hardened. "You're dismantling systems that built this empire." "No," Adrian answered quietly. "I'm dismantling systems that destroy everything connected to them." The room fell silent afterward, because everyone understood the real reason behind the changes. Elena, that was the emotional hook. Because love becomes disruptive once it changes powerful people fundamentally. Rumors spread quickly through Adrian's network. Their leader was becoming emotional, careless, soft, dangerous words inside criminal organizations. Because empires built on fear depended on certainty. And Adrian no longer looked certain. That was the intellectual hook. Because power structures become unstable the moment humanity enters leadership. Elena noticed the pressure building around him daily. The tense conversations. The growing frustration among his men. The silent judgment following every decision connected to her safety. And for the first time, she realized Adrian was sacrificing parts of himself for her. Not performatively. Actually, that realization complicated everything emotionally. Because monsters were easier to hate when they refused changing. That was the emotional hook. Because forgiveness becomes dangerous once people genuinely evolve. One evening, Elena found Adrian alone near the indoor pool area after another exhausting security meeting. The room reflected soft blue light across the water, while silence settled heavily between them. Adrian looked tired, not physically, emotionally, like years of control were collapsing beneath the weight of feelings he never learned how to carry properly. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotionally repressed people often break quietly instead of dramatically. "You're losing people because of me," Elena said softly. Adrian leaned against the railing without looking at her immediately. "No." Then after a pause, "I'm losing people because they only respected fear." Elena studied him carefully. "And what do you want now?" For several seconds he didn't answer, almost like the question itself confused him. That alone hurt her unexpectedly, because Adrian spent most of his life surviving instead of wanting. That was the emotional hook, because emotionally neglected people often reach adulthood without understanding healthy desire. Finally he spoke quietly. "Peace." The word sounded unfamiliar coming from him. Fragile. Human. Elena's chest tightened painfully hearing it, because peace was the one thing Adrian's world never allowed. That was the intellectual hook. Because people raised inside violence usually crave peace most desperately. He looked toward her slowly. "You were right about me." Elena frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I thought control was love." His voice lowered further. "But people who love someone shouldn't make them feel trapped." The honesty nearly shattered something inside her, because Adrian was finally seeing himself clearly. That was the emotional hook. Because emotional healing starts the moment people recognize the harm behind their survival instincts. Elena moved closer carefully. "You scared me." "I know." "You still do sometimes." Again, he accepted the truth without defense. And somehow that mattered more than apologies. That was the intellectual hook. Because accountability changes relationships more deeply than promises do. For a long moment silence stretched softly between them. Then Adrian surprised her again. "If you leave," he said quietly, "I'll still protect you." Elena stared at him. No conditions. No pressure. No emotional manipulation. Hidden beneath the words. Just genuine concern. That realization shifted something permanent inside her, because for the first time, Adrian was choosing her safety over his own emotional needs. That was the emotional hook. Because love becomes rare the moment someone values your freedom more than their own fear of losing you. Days later, Elena walked through the Eastern Gardens alone for the first time in months. No guards following directly beside her. No surveillance hovering visibly nearby. Only distant security hidden respectfully across the estate. Adrian had loosened control intentionally. And Elena noticed. That was the intellectual hook. Because trust is proven through restraint, not decorations. The freedom felt unfamiliar now. Almost frightening. Because somewhere along the way, the estate stopped feeling entirely like a prison. That emotional realization unsettled her deeply. She should have hated him completely. Part of her still wanted to. But another part, the part seeing his loneliness clearly now, understood him differently. That was the emotional hook. Because understanding someone emotionally becomes dangerous once it starts softening resentment. That evening, Elena entered Adrian's office quietly while he reviewed financial documents alone. He looked up immediately, always aware of her presence now, but softer about it, less controlling, more careful. That difference mattered. Elena stopped near the desk. You really meant it. Adrian lowered the file slowly. What? You let me leave. His eyes held hers steadily. Yes. No hesitation. No manipulation. Only truth. That was the intellectual hook. Because sincerity becomes powerful once control disappears completely. Elena looked down briefly, gathering thoughts she never expected to feel. You changed. Something complicated crossed Adrian's expression then. Not pride. Sadness. Too late? The answer hurt her unexpectedly, because she realized he genuinely believed she would still leave eventually. That realization exposed a lonely man beneath all the power finally. That was the emotional hook. Because emotionally damaged people often expect abandonment even after becoming better. Elena stepped closer slowly. You're not the same man who forced me into that wedding dress. Adrian looked away immediately, guilt darkening his expression. I remember every second of that night. And I remember the man who chased me through the storm. The silence between them deepened. Painful, honest, real. That was the intellectual hook. Because relationships heal slowly once both people stop hiding from the past. Elena's voice softened slightly. But I also remember the man who gave me freedom afterward. Adrian finally looked back toward her. Something fragile existed inside his expression now. Hope. Small. Dangerous. That was the emotional hook. Because hope terrifies emotionally wounded people more than rejection sometimes. Elena's heartbeat tightened painfully. Because this next decision changed everything. Staying meant accepting risk. Accepting Adrian's world. Accepting uncertainty. But leaving no longer felt emotionally simple either. Because somewhere between fear, storms, violence, and truth, she had started loving the lonely man beneath the empire. That realization frightened her completely. That was the intellectual hook. Because real emotional connection often develops after people stop trying to possess each other. Finally, Elena spoke quietly. I don't want to run anymore. Adrian went completely still. Not from control. From disbelief. Elena held his gaze steadily now. I'm staying because I choose to. The words shattered something invisible between them permanently. Because choice changed everything. That was the emotional hook. Because love only becomes real once it exists freely. For several seconds, Adrian said nothing. Then slowly, carefully, he moved closer without pressure, stopping just enough distance away for her to step back as she wanted. Elena didn't move, and for the first time since they met, peace existed between them, without fear controlling it. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotional safety begins where force finally ends. But outside the estate walls, their enemies were already moving again. Because men like Elijah Mercer did not fear romance. They feared weakness. And now Adrian Vale had finally shown the world exactly where his heart existed. That made war inevitable. Near midnight, alarms suddenly exploded across the estate grounds. Gunfire echoed violently beyond the eastern gates, while security teams rushed to the mansion corridors. Elena's blood turned cold instantly. Adrian turned sharply toward the windows, every survival instinct activating at once. Because this attack felt different. Closer, bigger, personal. That was the emotional hook. Because enemies strike hardest the moment people finally allow themselves happiness. And just hours after Elena willingly chose to stay beside him, war arrived directly at their doorstep. She once ran barefoot through the rain to escape him. Now she stood beside him while the world tried to tear them apart. The alarms echoed through Vale Estate like the beginning of war. Red security lights flashed across marble hallways, while armed guards rushed through the mansion with controlled urgency. Outside, distant gunfire cracked through the night air near the eastern gates, followed by the violent screech of tires somewhere beyond the estate walls. The attack had finally arrived openly. No more warnings. No more psychological games. Elijah Mercer was moving directly against Adrian Vale. That was the emotional hook, because enemies become most dangerous the moment fear stops being enough. Adrian stood near the office windows with terrifying stillness, while security updates poured through his phone rapidly. His expression had returned to the cold composure Elena remembered from the beginning, but now she understood something important. This version of Adrian was not emotionless. He was afraid, and fear inside powerful men often looked identical to control. That was the intellectual hook, because emotionally damaged people hide panic beneath discipline instead of vulnerability. Elena watched security vehicles race across the state ground below, while rain started falling heavily across the city again. Rain, the same kind that once carried her away from him barefoot and terrified. Now it returned during the moment everything threatened to collapse around them. That realization felt strangely symbolic. That was the emotional hook, because some storms return not to destroy people again, but to reveal how much they changed. Adrian turned toward her sharply. You need to leave the state. Elena's chest tightened instantly. No. His jaw hardened immediately. Elena, I'm not running again. The words interrupted him before he could finish. And for the first time since meeting her, Adrian did not immediately try controlling the outcome of the conversation. That alone showed how deeply he had changed. That was the intellectual hook, because real emotional growth appears in the moments people stop forcing decisions onto others. Another explosion echoed somewhere beyond the property walls. Closer this time. Security teams shouted instructions through radios downstairs while rain battered the enormous windows around them. War had officially reached this state. That was the emotional hook, because violence becomes terrifying once it enters the place people once considered safe. Adrian moved closer carefully. This isn't about pride. No, Elena answered quietly. It's about choice. The sentence silenced him instantly, because choice had become the center of everything between them now. Not ownership, not fear. Choice. That was the intellectual hook, because healthy love begins the moment freedom becomes respected. Elena stepped toward him slowly. You spent months deciding my future for me. Her voice remained calm despite the chaos surrounding them. I'm deciding this one myself. Adrian stared at her silently, and beneath the fear darkening his expression, something else existed too. Respect. That was the emotional hook, because people truly change once they start valuing another person's decisions equally. Finally, Adrian nodded once. Not agreement. Acceptance. And that difference mattered deeply. That was the intellectual hook, because acceptance without control becomes one of the purest forms of trust. Outside the estate, Elijah Mercer's men continued pushing aggressively toward the eastern security perimeter. Vehicles blocked nearby roads, while armed teams tested weaknesses around the property's outer defenses. But Adrian no longer approached conflict the way he once did. Months earlier, he would have responded with overwhelming violence immediately. Now, his first concern remained Elena's safety. That emotional shift changed his strategy completely. That was the emotional hook, because love alters not only what people fight for, but how they choose to fight. Inside the command room beneath the estate, Adrian's advisors argued openly for the first time in years. We eliminate Mercer tonight. Luca Mero snapped sharply across the table. No negotiations. No hesitation. Adrian remained calm near the surveillance screens. There are civilians near the southern district routes. Lucas stared at him in disbelief. Since when do you care about collateral damage? The room fell silent afterward, because everyone already knew the answer. Elena, that was the intellectual hook. Because emotional attachment changes moral boundaries. People once ignored easily. Adrian looked toward the security footage quietly. Since I learned violence doesn't stay contained. The sentence carried enough weight to silence the room completely, because nobody had ever heard Adrian Vale speak like that before. That was the emotional hook. Because transformation becomes undeniable once people begin rejecting the mindset that built them. Meanwhile, Elena remained upstairs watching the storm spread across the estate grounds, while emotions collided painfully inside her chest. Fear still existed. Of course it did. The violence surrounding Adrian's world remained real, dangerous, terrifying, but for the first time, she no longer feared Adrian himself. That realization changed everything emotionally. That was the intellectual hook. Because relationships heal once fear stops centering around the person beside you. Hours later, the conflict escalated violently. One of Elijah Mercer's inside informants triggered a security breach near the estate's underground access routes, allowing armed attackers closer to the mansion itself before defenses intercepted them. Gunfire erupted through the lower levels. Staff members evacuated. Security alarms screamed endlessly through the hallways. And suddenly the war no longer felt distant. It had entered the home directly. That was the emotional hook. Because violence feels different once it invades personal spaces instead of business territory. Adrian reached Elena's room within seconds. "We're moving." Elena immediately saw blood on his sleeve. Not his blood, but enough to remind her exactly how dangerous the night had become. That was the intellectual hook. Because reality destroys emotional illusions fastest during crisis. Rain hammered against the windows while Adrian guided her carefully through hidden corridors beneath the estate toward reinforced security routes. But unlike before, he explained every movement, every decision, every risk, not controlling her, including her. That difference mattered even now. That was the emotional hook. Because trust grows strongest during dangerous moments shared honestly. Halfway through the underground corridor, another explosion shook the estate violently enough to crack lights overhead. Elena stumbled slightly. Adrian caught her instantly. Protective, careful, not possessive. That distinction transformed everything between them now. That was the intellectual hook. Because intention changes the emotional meaning behind physical protection. They reached the secured underground operations room moments later, where remaining security teams monitored the collapsing perimeter defenses through dozens of surveillance screens. The situation looked worse than Elena imagined. Vehicles burning outside the estate gates, armed confrontations near the western gardens, security routes failing one after another. And at the center of all of it, Elijah Mercer trying to force Adrian into emotional desperation. That was the emotional hook. Because enemies attack hardest once they realize someone fights emotionally instead of strategically. Luke approached Adrian immediately. "We need evacuation." Adrian's eyes remained fixed on the screens. "No." Luke's frustration sharpened instantly. "You're choosing the estate over survival." Adrian looked toward Elena briefly before answering. "No. I'm ending this before it follows us forever." The sentence changed something inside Elena permanently. Because Adrian was no longer protecting power. He was protecting peace. That was the intellectual hook. Because healing begins once people stop fighting for ego and start fighting for future stability. Adrian turned toward Elena then. "You stay here." The old command remained inside the words automatically. But then he corrected himself. "Please." That single adjustment nearly shattered her emotionally. Because months ago, Adrian never asked. He decided. Now, even during war, he still respected choice. That was the emotional hook. Because the smallest signs of change often carry the deepest emotional meaning. Elena looked at him carefully. "You're going after Mercer yourself." Not a question. Adrian didn't deny it. Someone has to end this. Fear tightened painfully inside her chest. Not fear of him anymore. Fear for him. And realizing that terrified her completely. That was the intellectual hook. because love becomes undeniable once someone else's survival matters as deeply as your own. Adrian stepped closer slowly. If something happens tonight. Elena shook her head immediately. No. But Adrian continued quietly. You made me realize what kind of man I became. His voice lowered further. And what kind I still wanted to be. Emotion tightened painfully in Elena's throat, because Adrian sounded like a man preparing for loss. That was the emotional hook, because emotionally wounded people often expect happiness to disappear eventually. Without thinking, Elena grabbed his hand tightly, and for one suspended moment, the violence outside disappeared beneath the truth between them. No fear, no control, no forced promises. Only two damaged people choosing each other honestly. That was the intellectual hook, because healthy love is built through mutual choice during difficult moments. Elena looked directly into his eyes. Come back. The words carried more emotion than anything she had ever admitted to him before. Adrian's expression shifted subtly, not powerfully, humanly, and finally, he nodded once. That was the emotional hook, because emotionally broken people heal slowly through small moments of trust. The confrontation with Elijah Mercer ended before dawn, not through massive bloodshed, not through reckless destruction, but through exposure. Adrian leaked financial records, political connections, and criminal operations connected to Mercer's organization directly into federal investigations already targeting rival syndicates across the city. It destroyed Mercer's empire completely. Businesses collapsed overnight. Alliances vanished. Political protection disappeared. And by sunrise, Elijah Mercer was no longer untouchable. That was the intellectual hook, because true power is not always about violence. Sometimes it is about knowing when to stop using it. Adrian sacrificed enormous portions of his own empire during the process. Financial networks, underground partnerships, years of carefully built criminal influence, all burned away alongside Mercer's downfall. Luca and others viewed it as weakness, madness even. But Adrian no longer cared about maintaining the same empire, because somewhere along the way, Elena changed what victory meant to him. That was the emotional hook, because people evolve once someone finally becomes more important than power. Morning rain still covered the estate when Adrian finally returned. Exhaustion shadowed every movement now. The mansion around him looked damaged from the conflict. Broken glass, burn marks near outer walls. Security teams moving through aftermath quietly. But the war was over. And somehow, so was a version of Adrian who once forced Elena toward fear and obedience. That realization settled heavily inside him. That was the intellectual hook. Because survival sometimes requires destroying the identity people build around pain. Elena found him standing alone near the eastern garden entrance, where rain continued falling softly across the estate grounds. The same place where she once looked at the world feeling trapped. Now everything felt different. Adrian turned toward her slowly. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them no longer carried fear. Only history, growth, truth. That was the emotional hook. Because healed relationships are built from everything people survived honestly together. You destroyed half your empire, Elena said quietly. Adrian glanced toward the rain-covered city skyline, beyond the gates. It needed destroying. The answer surprised her less than it should have, because this man no longer measured success through control alone. That was the intellectual hook, because emotionally healthy choices often require letting go of harmful power. Rain soaked lightly through Elena's hair as she stepped closer toward him. Months ago, she ran barefoot into a storm believing freedom meant escaping Adrian Vale forever. Now, she stood beside him willingly. Not trapped, not controlled, choosing him. That emotional difference changed everything. That was the emotional hook, because love becomes meaningful only after fear stops controlling it. Adrian looked at her carefully. I can't promise a perfect life. Elena almost smiled softly. I don't trust perfect lives anymore. For the first time in a long time, something close to peace appeared between them. Not fantasy, not obsession. Something mature. Built slowly from truth, fear, mistakes, and choice. That was the intellectual hook, because real love is not built through fantasy. It is built through emotional honesty. Adrian reached for her carefully. not demanding, offering. And Elena placed her hand in his willingly. The storm around them softened into steady rain while the damaged estate stood quietly behind them like evidence of everything they survived. The same rain that once carried Elena away from Adrian had eventually brought them back together differently, not as prisoner and captor, not as obsession and fear, as equals. That was the emotional hook. Because emotional healing happens when people stop trying to own each other and start choosing each other freely. And as Elena stood beside the man she once feared most, she finally understood the truth hidden beneath every storm they survived together. She ran barefoot into the rain, believing freedom meant escaping him. But in the end, the man she feared most became the only one willing to burn his empire to protect her,